Wait, is this thing on? Can y'all hear me? Okay, here we go.
Woo! Just a dash. Just a dash. Just a dash. Just a dash.
Hey y'all. Welcome to another episode of Just a Dash. Y'all, wow. What to say? So everyone will be listening to this on the 28th of April, but I am currently recording on the 21st of April. It's the day after the trial, the verdict of He Who Must Not Be Named, because I am not calling that person's energy onto this show. But y'all, I hate to start it off on such a note, but it's been such a crazy, and I'm sure it's going to still feel this way even when this episode comes out, but so many emotions, so many mixed emotions about so many things that have taken place since the trial. It's tough, I think, as a Black person to just exist in a space of celebration. We lost another life soon after, which is, there's so many names to say still, and there's so many names to fight for still. So it's a weird space. It's a weird space that you exist in, of grief, of joy, of solitude, of comfort. And I think, we have to be gentle with ourselves in these moments and in these spaces. And there's nothing wrong with that. And for that very reason, actually, I'm just going to say it up front, and it's something that I mentioned in the last episode. So the last episode was 2 hours and 45 minutes, something like that, something crazy like that, y'all, because I was way too tired to edit things down. So you got to hear really just Alexis and I entirely in our element. But she was, and it was wonderful, honestly, to have her on and to just talk through so many fun topics with her and Are You For Real, and so many serious topics, and to really gauge her interest. And it's definitely something that I plan to do again in the future. I think one of my favorite things is really just bringing someone onto the mic whom I really admire and who I really adore. So, and there are so many people like that in my life that I'm excited to share this space with. But that being said, this week the episode is going to be so much shorter, y'all, because while I do want to chat a little bit about, my feelings regarding what's taken place, I think I really want to do that through Word to the Wise today. I don't have the capacity for Are You For Real? I don't think I have the capacity to discuss Black trauma or Black death. I think something that's really important that I've had to teach myself, that I've had to honor for myself, is that I don't have to show up in the space and share my feeling on it if it's going to be harmful to me. I think sometimes I have felt in the past this sort of pressure to speak up on every issue that's happening and everything that impacts me or everything that I'm feeling. And I think that was kind of a way of showing people exactly where I stand. It was a form of resistance, and it definitely came from a genuine place, right? But in the same token, it also feels like I'm still trying to prove something. And who do we have to prove something to, Like, in the end, we need to take care of ourselves. And so for me this week, that means skipping over the Are You For Real ingredient, and I hope y'all are cool with that. Definitely, these are topics, I don't even want to refer to people as topics. These are experiences, these are moments, these are circumstances that are very telling of where we're at as a nation, and also allow us the opportunity to rewrite history, to do things differently. And so what I will say is the verdict brought me a lot of relief, because I was nervous of what the result might be. And that alone already dictates what the problem is, in this country. So I don't think that should be surprising to anyone. And, so let me tell you a little bit about what Say What is going to be about, this on this episode. So, in my own experiences, every workplace I've inhabited operates in a relatively similar structure. When it comes to the workplace culture, there are obvious situations that are deemed inappropriate and over communicated as such. There are very, very staple things that we have an understanding of, whether that's harassment, whether that's overt sexism or overt racism. But like always, those ground rules make sense in theory, because a lot of times you might find yourself in these very sort of gray areas. You might find yourself unsure of how you're supposed to respond, or sometimes in a moment when somebody says something entirely inappropriate to you. If you're like me, and I said this in the last episode, I just laugh uncomfortably because I'm shook. I'm rocked that you even fixed your mouth to say that. So sometimes you find yourself in situations and predicaments, in relationships and dynamics that are harmful or toxic or uncomfortable at work, for whatever reason. So in practice, really workplaces are littered with gaps. Gaps in how we support our team structures, gaps in healthy leadership, gaps in how we respond in crises or uncomfortable moments. There is even gaps in what we think is okay to say or do or respond. And so, and really the word gaps minimizes how damaging those gray areas can be. So what I wanted to do in this episode was talk about those gray areas a little bit more, at least at an introductory level. And I was really, really lucky to have someone really wonderful. Her name is Kim, and I think y'all will really find her so informative and she just kept it real, and I really appreciate that and she knows her stuff. I think that's such an important combination when somebody knows what they're talking about and they're entirely genuine about it, and you can tell they're passionate about her work. And it was just really such a pleasure having this conversation with her. And the reason I wanted to chat about that a little bit is because it also inspired Word to the Wise. I think in so many spaces that we are asked to show up in, I think in so many conversations, even where we may not align on our viewpoints or where we are trying to work through very difficult circumstances or hold space for many different emotions, there's one thing that we have to hold on to. And this quote inspired that for me, along with another quote that I want to talk about as well. So this week's Word to the Wise, y'all. Y'all ready? So this week's Word to the Wise is the following. My humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. That quote is from Desmond Tutu. Super simple. And if you don't know who Desmond Tutu is, he's a South African Anglican, I think he's Anglican cleric and theologian. He's known for his work on anti-apartheid, and he's a human rights activist. And I think most people probably recognize him. He was the Bishop of Johannesburg in 1985, I think for about a year, 1985 and 1986, and also of Cape Town. So he fuses a lot of ideas of Black theology and African theology, and he's just a very intriguing person. But, the reason that quote really was inspiring to me this week is because in all the spaces that we show up in, whether it's work, whether it's in our personal lives, whether we're at a protest, whether we're talking to someone of a different generation, whether we have to talk to a child, whether we have to hold space for ourselves, at the end of the day, I think the one thing I really, really try to hold on to is what it means to be human, what it means to show up for another person, what it means to be kind, to be mindful, to be patient, to be loving, to be nurturing, to be comforting, to be angry, to be frustrated, to be aggravated, to be critical. There's so many things. There are so many things that shape the DNA of humanity. And I think there's so much that should unite us that we don't make room for, that we don't recognize. And that really, was eminent to me. I'm so happy again with the verdict and what the result was, but it was wild watching this trial unfold, a trial that should have never taken place. First of all, honestly, this is not justice, and we know that this is solely accountability, and it's not even enough because it doesn't cover the system. But that being said, we still have to take the seeds where they're planted. And George Floyd, he made a plot for an entirely new garden. And I'm forever grateful for that man's sacrifice. But throughout the period of this trial, the arguments that were made in defense of the actions that were taken, it was just absolutely horrific. I mean, at one point, somebody tried to argue that George Floyd said he ate too many drugs instead of I ain't do drugs. I ain't do no drugs. And not that even any of that matters, and it's like, at the end of the day, the jury got to meet the crowd, and people could see through that. They could see that they weren't some angry mob. They could see the humanity of these people. And so, so many things have taken place, even surrounding the trial. We've lost more lives. We've lost children. Ma'Khia Bryant, Adam Toledo, Dwayne Wright. There are just so many more names that I'm sure I'm not even, aware of. And so many things have been spoken about in the news, but something that really struck me as well, and also, felt very linked to this quote, on CNN, there was a really searing analysis made about the state of police violence against people of color in the United States. And it was on Don Lemon's show. And shout out to Don Lemon, y'all, because Don Lemon has really turned over a new leaf, I can say, in the last few years or so. But he had Harvard professor Cornel West on his show. And this man always drops like just complete words of wisdom. And we are lucky to be graced by someone of such respectability, honestly. And he's just such a cool dude. He always refers to everyone as my brother and my sister. And he really, no matter what show I've seen Professor Cornel West on, he is always respectful, even if I've seen him on Fox News where they've literally tried to interrupt him. And he is as patient as can be, honestly. So it's truly so wonderful, and yet he's firm in his beliefs. But needless to say, sorry, y'all, I'm rambling, but there was something that he said on the show, and it was really just so striking. He said, "Do we have the will to stay in contact with the rich humanity of Black people, with the beauty, intelligence, the tenderness, the soulfulness of Black people?" You're talking about a human being, a precious son, a precious daughter, to get beyond the stereotype. Because for the first 100 years, America failed on the question. I just like, and I said it before, there are so many people who will say things as succinctly and even better than I ever could. And this was one of those moments. Do we have the will to stay in contact with the rich humanity of Black people? I know I do. For sure. And it's not because it's just my identity. And I think that that's really important to also remind people of. I am not mindful and loving and learning to evolve and growing because I only care about Black people because I am Black. I care about identities that don't even relate to me. I care about people who are older than me, who are younger than me, who are of every skin tone, who are of every sexual orientation. And the thing is, like, it goes beyond humanity for me. I care about every living being on this planet. We have to hold space for all of it because we are all interconnected. We have no idea how this world is actually constructed or how it functions or what all the paradigms are. We really don't. We have no clue if this is an actual simulation or if this is a matrix. Who knows? We are all out here trying to do the best that we can. And that's what we all should be doing. But that should include being mindful of each other. We have to coexist on this planet. We might as well treat each other with respect. That's where I'm at. So it was really just something that reminded me of that. My humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. There is a lot to hold right now, a lot of emotions. There is a lot of thoughts to process through. There are a lot of truths to hold, a lot of truths to reckon with, to acknowledge, to navigate through, to heal. There are so many wounds. And I'm just reminded of so many different quotes from from civil rights leaders about recognizing when there's a knife in someone's back. That was from Malcolm X. And we are healing, but we also have to recognize and make room for us to acknowledge all the wounds that we have so that we really aren't just patching things up. We're actually doing medicinal work. We are actually sowing new seeds. We are creating a new garden. And I'm really grateful that I'm continuing to let go of what doesn't serve me and allow things that support me and comfort me and help me evolve and grow. I'm letting that into my life. I need that as a Black woman. I need that as a Black person. And this is a space for that. So that is this week's word to the wise, y'all. You know, even if you don't identify as a Black person, it is a quote to take into deep consideration and to recognize what that truly means in the existence that you get to have, in the experience that you are sharing with other people on this planet. How are you expressing your humanity today? That's the question I leave you with. So that's this week's word to the wise. And, you know, I am praying and hoping, y'all, that we continue to see progress, even if it's in small incremental moments. I am sowing into the seeds that we will continue to recognize what humanity can look like and should look like for everybody who is on this planet and coexisting. I'm really excited for this week's Say What, and we're going to get into it. Like I said before, we're going to skip over Are You For Real this week, y'all, but Say What is going to be a great interview for you to listen to, and you know I have some excellent recommendations on deck for you as well. So let's get into it. It's time for Say What?
Just a dash.
Thank you so much for being here. This is actually, I say this for every episode, but I am excited about this episode just because I work with someone you're related to. I work with Samara, which is really exciting. She works directly on my team. She's one of my favorite people. She knows that. But
Me too.
I definitely wanted to talk to you in this episode just because, especially in the last year or so, I think a lot of people are realizing certain things that they're unhappy about in their workspaces, whether it's management or wellness or the way people are checking in on them. So I really kind of wanted to tap into the mind of someone who has experience in HR and kind of see what it's like on the other side in terms of how we manage through those situations or how HR has evolved. So with that being said, please share with the people who you are, what you do, and why you love what you do.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me.
Of course.
And yes, Samara is one of my favorite people, so we definitely have that in common. My name is Kim Sherman, and I actually, at this point, am an associate professor of economics and management at one of the state universities in Massachusetts. And it's really my second career. Well, at least my second career. So what I would consider my first kind of real professional career, I worked in human resources. And so just like quickly kind of what I've done. So I started off as a recruiter for an insurance company in New York City. Love that job because I loved talking to people and just hearing people's stories. To me, being a recruiter is you get to hear people's stories, and I love that. From that, I went to work for a small consulting company in human resources, and that was great because it gave me a chance to kind of work with lots of different companies and get to know different cultures. Mostly they were kind of Fortune 500, so big companies. From there, I went to IBM, and I worked in IBM human resources, doing a whole bunch of different jobs. Ended up being a manager for a group. We supported about 30,000 employees, so it was a huge group in IBM.
Yeah.
Loved IBM. I mean, I love the opportunities, great people who worked there. And then I decided, for lots of reasons, that I was ready for a change, personally and professionally. I was actually getting married. I was moving. I was doing all these. And for some reason, I decided I'd go back and get my PhD. Like why, you just kind of decide. But for me, I really liked that I could go back and learn some of the kind of the theory behind HR and management, because I'd already done it. So I could kind of apply what I'd done. And now I was like, oh, there are some reasons why we do things the way we do.
Right.
Did that, and then got a job teaching at the university that I'm at right now. So I have had a chance to see academic and actual, hands-on doing the work, practitioner work. I've been mostly, when I worked in industry, at fairly big companies. So I kind
Yeah,
of have that perspective versus the perspective, which I think can be a little different, is when you work for a small company or
like a
a
startup.
family company, startup. I think it is different.
Yeah,
So just to say, I kind of still come at it a little bit from a little bit more of a kind of bigger corporate perspective
sure.
versus the family owned, kind of having to wear many hats type of
Right,
perspective.
right. First of all, thank you. This is great. You have so much experience. And I always love when people talk about their experiences, especially because it's eclectic for everyone. It doesn't matter, even if you work in one industry, you've worked in many different sorts of work environments. And,
Hmm.
they all come with their own challenges and they all come with their own benefits. So I think that's really great. And obviously I work at NYU and that's huge, a
Hmm.
huge sort of, it's non for profit, but it's still a huge, corporation in a way. And it's interesting you were talking about HR in theory because that's something I was thinking about because in the last decade of working for me, I've worked for Broadway, I've worked in fine arts, now I work at NYU in higher education. And the one thing that, it's an unfortunate occurrence is that there's always really a case, for, whether it's sexism or racism or homophobia or bad management, bad leadership. I don't think that's shocking to people that that might exist in workspaces. But the other thing that's always been consistent for me is that I'm never sure how HR can help me navigate because
Hmm.
sometimes you have to wonder, who is HR working for? Are they on behalf of the employees or is it on behalf of the company? So really, who are they truly invested in? And if it's not, if it's not for you, who's influencing those different, decisions? And the thing is, HR stands for human resources. So that's who you want to go to. But oftentimes, I think people are unsure how to navigate those spaces or how they can trust HR. And it kind of leads to this sort of strange gray area. So, and of course, you toss in race relations, you toss in privilege, you toss in gender. There's always something to report on, but is the reporting even happening? And then how
Hmm.
effective is it? So
Hmm.
I've, again, like I found myself wondering, what does an HR professional actually think about all the chaos that goes on in workplaces, and how do they actively seek to create more equitable experiences for employees? And also what's weighed in that decision making when, they are presented with cases that require disciplinary action at any level. So the areas that I really want to tap into for this conversation are really the basics of HR, bad bosses, which I feel like everybody has dealt with, uncomfortable situations and what the solutions are for that, relationships in the workplace. And then the last thing is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, I know you have experience in and you have interest in. So I definitely am curious. So just diving in, my first question is really, what is HR and what purpose is it supposed to serve in workspaces?
Hmm. Well, that's a really good question, and I think I will preface it by saying it's gonna be different in every company, and I think it will be very different, the size of the company and the industry of the company and so on. But I will say, from my experience, I think it was eye opening to really, it's human resources, right? And it used to be that the joke has kind of been that the people that used to go into HR would be like, I'm such a people person. I love people.
Right,
I want to go into HR because I just want to help people, which is really important as an HR person. If you hate people, you really shouldn't go into HR, right? That's
right.
just not a good place for
Yeah,
you.
you're going to need to talk to people.
Yeah, yeah, you have to, you're gonna have to interact with people. Um, but I will say that human resources is kind of in that middle position between, you're there to support management and you're there to uphold the policies and the practices of the organization, and you're there to support and be the voice of employees. But that balance of where, how, which side it tips to, I think depends a lot on the culture of the organization.
Mm,
I think it depends a lot on the management of the organization. And so I would say that it is more management driven. I also think that it's changed a lot because I think over the years, particularly in public companies, and I'd say it's probably true for all companies these days, but the legal function has taken on increasing significance. And so I think you have the legal function that can be really critical, like you said, with all kinds of potential liabilities and
Mm-hmm.
cases.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a very particular role to play, right? Like they have to protect the assets of the company.
Right.
And, like that's their role. And then you have finance has taken on a much bigger role if you are a public company, if you're a for profit, right? Because it didn't used to be that, in the olden days, companies didn't have to every single quarter report how they're doing and what money they're
Right.
making and,
Right. Everything is
share
intertwined now into the bottom line.
exactly everything into the bottom line for so many companies. And I mean, I
Mm.
hope and think maybe that's starting to shift a little bit again. I don't know. But so you have finance so I feel like HR has really gotten into this position where they are trying to navigate legal, finance, employees,
Right.
top management. And it's a tricky position. It is a tricky position to be in. So, from the employee perspective, absolutely I think HR is still the advocate for employees, but I think um, it would be naive to think that in all companies the employees come first above some of those other stakeholders. I think, they balance with them, but I do think that HR it now has a role to play that is much trickier than it might have been, a couple decades ago.
So, based on what you're saying, then, how would you, because it seems like it's subjective. It seems like it depends on where you work, it depends on the workplace culture, it depends on what's at stake, whether what product you're selling or who you're trying to appeal to, whoever your audiences are, that dictates, I guess, almost the standards of behavior and the standards of how people respond to those rules being broken or whatnot. It seems like there's a little bit of a gray area. So, what is your recommendation? How does someone understand their HR culture? Like, what is the best way to get to know who is the best advocate for you? I guess really my question is, what metrics do we use as employees to know how successful our HR department is in our favor versus our company's favor?
Yeah. Well, first I will also say that there are laws. Like there are laws that companies can't break.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of, the HR role is to make sure that above and beyond anything else that certain laws can't be broken. So for certain problems, whether your HR department is good or not, like tough shit, there are laws that they have to be paying attention to.
Right.
So, but that's for, hopefully things that are on the kind of extreme end of the spectrum. And hopefully most people aren't dealing with that in the workplace. But in terms of, how do you know how much of an advocate your HR department is going to be for you, or, how much you can count on them to kind of help um, manage when there are tricky or difficult situations.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of it is really just reading the tea leaves, paying attention to what kinds of things do they
Right.
communicate? What is their messaging? How accessible are they? If you go and talk to them, what's their response? How do they respond? Do they respond? If you call and say you have an issue, are they, hey, come on up to my office, I really want to talk to you about it? Or, is it more of a kind of cursory email,
Mm.
that
The
kind of thing?
standard
So I think some
reply.
of it, yeah, I think it is a little bit of of an art to just feel it out a
Assess
little
it.
bit.
Yeah, assess it. Okay.
Mhm.
That's helpful to know because diving into, the next area. So I was, I think everybody at some point in their life has had a bad boss. I don't think that that's anything new, but I was doing some research and according to careerbuilder.com, it shows that 58% of managers said they didn't receive any management training. So that means most managers in the workforce, they're either being promoted because they're good at what they do
Mhm.
singularly, or sometimes it's even by seniority. They've just been there a long time, right? But not necessarily because they're good at making people around them better. And so I think that leads to a lack of empowerment. And, you have a bunch of leaders who aren't trained to lead. So, and there's a lot of, I think, delusion going on around that because in the same study, 89% of bosses believe employees quit because they want more money, when in reality, only 12% do for that reason, and 79% do because of the lack of appreciation.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think my question here is because, that seems to be such a prominent issue, when is it appropriate to involve HR when a manager's dynamic is toxic or ineffective to their team? And realistically, what can be done about that? And let's
Mm-hmm.
hypothetically think about this if the HR department is more so actually, if they are in the favor of the employee and if not so much, like what are the different takes on that?
Right. And I would say, I think the same selective perception applies to HR as well. I don't think there's an
Mm,
HR person or an HR function that would not feel like they are the advocates for employees.
okay.
Right. So, and I think most are. I mean, I just think it's a matter of degree, and it's a matter of, I want to make sure I'm not saying HR departments don't care about their employees, because that's not true at all. There's other
There's
things that
different
they
things they
also
have
have
to
to,
weigh, different
yeah,
factors, which I think is in everyone's job, even like employees going to HR when you're thinking about the stakeholders, whether it's your team around you and how you're going to change the dynamic if you report on an issue. I think a lot of people don't go to HR because they do think about all the other factors with a
right.
company. So I think if someone ends up there, they really do need help.
Right. And I think it's always you kind of calculate what are the benefits and the potential downsides of going to HR. So I think the first thing is, of course, always trying to work with that manager. I mean, as much as possible, if nothing else, to like do due diligence. Like I tried, because if somebody came to me, I would probably say, well, have you talked to your manager?
Hmm.
Right? Have you expressed some of these concerns, or would this totally come as a surprise to him or her? So I think it's, of course, always good to try to talk to your manager and and explore kind of how you might work together more productively.
Hmm.
Now, there's a huge difference between, I have a boss, a manager, who is, a total misogynist,
Right.
racist, couldn't give a crap about employees.
Right.
That's a little harder to talk to than the manager who just, doesn't ever spend even 10 minutes helping me understand what my role is, so I feel like I'm failing because I have a lack of clarity.
Right.
Right? Like
There's a
the second
spectrum.
is yeah, second is much easier to go in with some specific kind of questions and some, ways to ask for something that you need.
Hmm.
A lot harder when it's the other end of the problem. So I think first is seeing if you can work with your manager in some ways
Okay.
and being really specific about what you need and what you're not getting. And of course, this is always easier if you are good at your job, right?
Sure.
And I mean, that's like,
That would be a helpful take on that.
yeah. And I mean, to be fair, sometimes people aren't good at their jobs because they haven't gotten the
And the
direction,
support
or
they
they
need.
themselves haven't gotten the training,
Right.
or, there's a lot of reasons why people may be not doing the level of work that they could be doing.
Right.
So I think as much as an employee as you can tap into what do you need. But it is always easier if you're a really good employee, you have a little bit more leverage on your
I was
side,
gonna
right?
say, I think when I was in that situation, I've been in this scenario before. My approach was to be like, I want to be able to do my job well, so
Yeah,
that I am meeting your standards. I
exactly.
want to be able to deliver on what you want, but in order to do that, I need X, Y, and Z so that I can be performing better. And I was able to do that because I was doing well enough, but I needed a little bit more support. But I do agree that there is a spectrum. And I do also
Mhm.
think though, because there gets to a point where you do all those steps and you're still not getting what you need from
Right.
a manager. There's still not the support you need. There's still not the mindfulness that you need. I think sometimes it can feel a little nuanced because I think of last year, it wasn't necessarily about being supported in the work that you're doing, but more so in your headspace because we're in
Mhm.
isolated spaces. As a person of color, there's all this violence happening around you. And I think sometimes there is this lack of awareness for someone to say, how are you doing? How are
Mm-hmm.
you feeling? I think that sometimes is also missing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I wonder, I don't know if HR, I don't know if they help, managers navigate that, or if there's training on those sorts of things, or who would do that. But I always think that that is something that's also missing.
I think it has to be HR's role to help managers navigate that because, like I said, HR now wants there was this, I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, HR has a seat at the table. We want a seat at the table,
Right.
right? Like that was the big thing when HR was trying to move from paper pushers, no offense, HR, from paper pushers up to like a strategic role,
Right.
right? And if you're going to have a strategic role in the success of the organization, that has to be part of that has to be helping managers create a productive and effective environment,
Right.
right? Because if you create a toxic environment, your company's not going to be
It's
successful.
not
It
going to
might
be
be successful in
sustainable. It's not sustainable.
it's not
And
sustainable.
I think that
Right.
I think it's, I don't know if it's easier, but I feel like that it's easier to almost pinpoint where those rotten apples are when you're in a smaller company. But I honestly, and this is no offense to NYU, I love NYU, I say this all the time. I think because it's such a well-oiled machine, it's kind of
Mhm.
hard to pick out where those bad apples are, because at the end of the day, everything still looks shiny and everything still looks great from the outside looking in. No one would know about some of the
Right.
things that happen behind the scenes. And so I think it's easy to kind of be oblivious to those things. And a lot of things end up
Mhm.
flying under the radar.
And that's where I think employees have to be the voice to say, no, 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 no. This is not like you may think everything's going well, but let's hear what some of the real truths are.
Hmm.
And that's hard. And I think in some ways that gets easier the more employees who are willing to speak up together because it's not one lone voice.
Right.
It's it's a number or groups of individuals who can say, this is not one person's experience. This is a lot of our experience, and we need to bring this forward because this is not all, you know, peaches and cream.
Right.
Things are not working for some of us, and so
Right.
I think that that is really critical because otherwise, you're right. The facade can look great. And I mean, the facade can look great for people who are in particular positions of privilege, who don't see things maybe through the same lens
Right.
as other employees and individuals. And unless that's brought up and brought to the attention of people who can make a change, nothing's going to happen,
Right.
right? And what's going to happen is people are going to get frustrated and feel dejected and pissed off. And then if they leave and nobody said anything, they've left their job and everything stayed the same
Right.
where they were.
Right.
And so nothing will change.
Yes. And I think that's a huge thing. I mean, I think that's something I had to learn was, even if I could leave the situation, I still need to make HR aware of what was happening so that they have something on document. And I won't name the company that I worked for, but there was a situation related to just harassment taking place in the workplace. And I ended up leaving, nothing, it wasn't to me directly, but I just ended up
Mhm.
leaving the job. And I found out soon afterwards that they were doing sexual harassment trainings. And I do think part of it was because I wasn't just a bystander, and I went and said, this is happening. I'm not going to be here anymore, but this is happening. And, you should address it. And it was still kind of messy how we got to that point. I think sometimes as an employee, you sometimes end up feeling like a scapegoat of some sorts when you're the one
Mhm.
reporting, which I do want to ask. So when you are, let's say there is an open case underway, how should a person operate when they've informed HR that something has happened? How do you go back knowing that you might have, reported something that's happening on your team or in your workplace? What's the best way to navigate that? Should you keep quiet? Should you make your, lateral coworkers aware so that they're not caught off guard? What's the best way to navigate that sort of situation?
Yeah. So one thing that I think is really tricky is HR really, once they've started an investigation, really can't talk about it for the most part.
Hmm.
I mean, I think they have an obligation to communicate to a certain extent, but then it does get into all kinds of, confidentiality. And I think that's really frustrating for people
Mm-hmm.
because I think depending upon the issue and depending upon, kind of how public it is, I think it can feel really frustrating to not hear more, know more, see more. And that I know that creates a lot of can really create a lot of kind of disruption and distrust, because then you don't know, well, what are you doing about it?
Yeah.
You tell me you're doing something, but you can't tell me what you're doing. So how do I know you're doing? So that becomes a very kind of tricky um, uh, area to try to navigate. But in terms of the individual, I think saying to HR, like, can you tell me, like, how is this going to be handled?
Mm.
Who is this going to be communicated to? How will I know that this is actually anything's going forward with this? Because even if they can't say exactly what they're going to do, I think they have an obligation to at least tell you as much as they can
Right.
to inform. So there's some sense of, okay, I have some idea that this hasn't gone into some black hole.
Right.
And,
And what
or,
best practices to navigate through it.
right. And even to say, if it's, with a particular individual, like, can you explain to me how this will be discussed with that individual?
Mm.
Because as the person who's coming forward, you don't want to be caught off guard.
Right.
Like, it's not fair to you to then be walking around thinking, well, have they talked to the person? Have they not talked to the person? When that person starts being even more of a jerk to me, well, is it
Right.
because they just had
Right.
that conversation with HR? So I think, like, that's a little bit of a place where you should have HR on the hook a little
Okay.
bit to say, I need to just understand what's at least kind of going on, so I know I have some idea of
Mm-hmm.
what to expect.
Mm-hmm.
Because, ambiguity is one of the most stressful
It
things.
ugh, whew, Kim, and uncertainty is not it.
Yeah.
I need to know how to set my expectations, how to manage my expectations, and also I think people forget, but like we're emotional beings, and the way you
Hmm.
show up at work and the way, if you're feeling anxious, you're not going to perform well. Or if you think that there's something hanging over your head, or this person knows this information,
Right.
or how's this going to roll out? Like you were saying, is this person going to now be actually worse towards me because I said something? Like you
Yeah.
really don't know. So I actually think that that's really helpful advice, like that there is a way to kind of glean some information so you know how to navigate. So
Hmm.
that's super, super helpful. I actually have a very specific situation that a friend shared with me that I'm curious what your thoughts would be on it. So this was an example a friend shared with me. She told me that one day at work, one of her coworkers brought up the fact that Debbie Allen, so I guess just Debbie Allen and her partner, may be swingers, and their boss followed up by saying, well, she goes that way. So basically speaking down on someone's sexual orientation and their choices. And that
Hmm.
was particularly offensive to my friend because they identify that way.
Hmm.
So they didn't participate in the conversation, but they were uncomfortable because other people were participating in it. So I don't think obviously every case requires a conversation with HR, but if that's something that happens continuously, what is the best approach for situations in which you want to speak up and try to course correct what's happening in a meeting, for example?
Hmm. Well, I think the first question is, would there be any opportunity, maybe even in private, for that individual to say to their boss, that made me very uncomfortable when you said that?
Mm.
Because, I mean, again, if we're a little bit generous, we can accept that some people need to be educated,
Mhm.
right? Or need to be reminded. And actually, we just had a situation at my school where a bunch of the faculty were listening to a speaker, and they made a comment that they didn't contextualize.
Mm.
And so if it wasn't contextualized, it could have been taken somewhat offensively.
Right.
Right. And so we had a big discussion about, well, you know, should it be something that we then go back and just explain, this is how we heard this.
Right.
And, this is why we feel like that was a little bit problematic. So I think part of it is, is there an opportunity to have a one-on-one discussion maybe afterward, so it's not public, so the person doesn't get their backup? Or depending upon the culture, if you feel like, no, I want everybody to hear that there's a reason why you
Right.
shouldn't really say that,
Mhm.
That's great. If somebody is able to step into that conversation and be brave, that depends a lot, I think, on the culture of the company
Right.
and how comfortable they are with potentially creating a little bit of uncomfortable or a little bit of conflict if
Right.
the person is defensive about that. But from an HR perspective, I think, going and even just saying, and again, this is where you hope that you have receptive HR people to say, hey, this happened in my meeting, and I'm not here to, call my boss out, but how do we deal with these things in this company? How should we handle this when my boss said that and it made me uncomfortable and it could have made some of the other coworkers
Right.
uncomfortable? And I didn't feel like I could say something because it's my boss,
Hmm.
and there's always power differentials. How HR person would you counsel me to handle this type of situation again? How do we handle it as a community?
Yeah. That's huge. I don't think I ever, that's huge for me. I don't think I ever thought of HR as a counselor of sorts, someone I could go to just to advise me, even if I don't want to report something. I think people are of the mind that you go to HR when you're ready to lock in that report and you're ready to stir up some trouble, I guess, So I think that's really helpful. I think it's interesting you say that because, and I was talking about this the other day with a couple of friends. I don't think, and I don't know if it's because it might have to do with identity, as a Black person, I think there's certain relationships you have with authority and respect for elders that kind of dictates how you respond to people above you and how you feel about reporting people above you. It never occurred to me in any situation that I was dealing with that was either toxic or inappropriate to go to HR. It was
Mm,
never, I never thought like, oh, that will be supportive of me or that's what I need to do. Instead, it was like, I need to fix what I'm doing to correct this situation.
hmm.
So it's useful to know that you can go to HR just for advice on how to
Right.
navigate a situation. How do you think people can get over, though, the guilt of potentially, someone being reprimanded or someone losing their job because of what you shared? Like, how do you, because I think that also prevents people, like, they don't want to get someone else in trouble. So they deal with the situation.
Right. So, and again, I will say not all HR people are going to be like, oh, Dash, thank you. I'm so happy to see you. Please sit down. Let's
Right.
talk. Right.
Let's chat.
But yeah, part of HR should be advice and counsel. Now, we tend to think about that towards managers,
Right.
right? Advice and counsel help managers, and then managers should be able to do that down. Like it's,
A
like we
funnel.
help them and they help down. But if you have somebody who's kind of not good at that, if you have a crappy
Mhm.
manager, then how do you work, like you said, how do you move that bottleneck? So I think it's, feel it out. And I think you said something before that I think is really important and answers your last question. When you approach it like, I'm looking out for what is best for the company, for me to do my job as well as I can, to be effective. I think it's always hard to argue with somebody or to dismiss somebody when they're truly there to say, look, I feel like I'm not being able to contribute my best because of this. And so I think the idea of, if you're going to HR or you're going to, maybe it's even to your manager's manager, although that gets even a little bit dicier.
Yeah.
I would rather go to HR, I think,
Hmm.
and even do the hypothetical probably before I would go to a manager's manager, unless you have a good relationship. I mean,
Right.
some of this is about relationships in the workplace and the culture of the workplace. But I think to say, this has kind of been happening. And again, if it was a one-time thing, most of us, I think, are, I mean, who among us have not said something once that we were like, ooh,
Yeah, that might have
like,
come
ooh,
across the wrong way. Yeah.
yeah. But if it's kind of prevalent or if it was egregious, I think just going and saying, this is making it hard for me. I'm feeling kind of stressed about it, or I'm feeling like I'm having a hard time getting back to focus on what I need to do. It's always when it's about, I want to do my best. I want to create an environment where everybody can do their best. I think that that's a really genuine or authentic reason to be bringing these things forward.
Hmm.
And so if the guilt of, what if I say something and that person loses their job? Okay. You could also think, like in the case of the example you gave, well, what if I don't say something
Hmm.
and they keep saying things like that? and then they do something that's worse than just saying
Right.
it, and then the company is potentially looking at
A greater
something bigger.
lawsuit. Right.
Yeah, a lawsuit or something else. So I think, and particularly, the silver lining, I think, of some of what's come out in the last couple of years, particularly around harassment, sexual harassment, and the silver lining is companies, I think, know, it's at your peril
Mm,
if you ignore when things are brought forward. Like,
right.
you can't do that anymore. You can't just kind of be like, oh, that's just how he
Right.
is.
And I think it's because, and not unfortunately, it just is what it is. I don't think it's coming even from this place of morality. It's that it impacts their bottom line. If that comes out, you're screwed. Like, like
Yeah.
that's the last thing you want on your record as a company, is that any sort of case of harassment, or even nowadays, homophobia or transphobia, like anything where any sort of identity is being mistreated, it just isn't a good look. So I do think that's a very strong point, that and a strong case for why people should feel more comfortable, because the
Mhm.
reality is your company most likely won't be happy with that and won't tolerate it. So it may be easier than you think, for
Right.
to report that and not feel guilty about it, and to also feel like you were saying you're making it a better workspace and work environment for everyone. And also, not that it's our job to teach anyone per se, but I do realize there are certain people, they don't have any sort of awareness of how
Mhm.
their behavior is impacting other people or how harmful it might be. And sometimes that's a
Mhm.
wake up call for them to know that, hey, like this was brought up to a point where we have to open a case on it.
Right. Right. But I appreciate your point about not s- employees not feeling like they have to be the ones to educate all the time, because I
Right.
think it can put employees in a very difficult position. I think that's another reason why, if you feel like you have an HR department that's at all open to hearing some of these things, to be
Mhm.
able to say, I don't want to be the one to keep bringing this up because it puts me in an uncomfortable
Right.
position, but these are the things that are happening. You should know that these are the things that are being said.
Yeah, I
um,
agree. Do you think that there certain things that HR wishes employees came to them about more often? Like, are there things that HR wishes people were more empowered to speak up about, or people don't necessarily think HR can be helpful with?
I think HR usually wishes that their managers would do a better job, like, as you said.
We all have that same wish, Kim.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, and to be fair, it is true when you get no training, no nothing, and you're just thrown into a job. How do we expect people to be good managers? I
Right.
mean, some people will learn and learn quickly, and if you're open to hearing from
And hearing
people and
feedback.
hearing feedback, hearing that you're not doing so well, and if you have a boss that's actually being a mentor, and
Yeah.
helping to train you, great. But if you don't have that, that's there's no surprise that we have a lot of people who are not good
Yeah. I
managers.
think that's the secret, though, what you were saying about feedback. Most managers have not been open to constructive criticism or feedback. They
Mhm.
assume that because they're in that role, they know everything that they're doing, and that there's no need to learn from someone above them, or they're at a point now where they can dictate and manage however they feel like. And in reality, if you're working on a team, everybody influences each other's, work. And so everyone has to kind of have a good middle ground, a common place where you feel safe enough to have feedback that's equitable. And I don't think that happens. I think of reviews, like I get reviewed by my boss, but I'm not reviewing my boss. And they're being reviewed by their boss, but their boss doesn't know my relationship to them, So there's gaps in between that I think lead to that. So I think it's actually really great to hear that HR wishes their managers were managing a little bit better. But I think you bring up a great point. And I think, the study brought up a great point, that it's also about training and making sure that people are prepared to be in that role. Because I think people really, management to me is not just about telling people what to do. It's knowing, how this person needs to be supported to grow development. Like, how do they develop professionally, and what are they interested in learning, and what are their strengths and what are their weaknesses, and how do you help those weaknesses become less and become more so strengths? And I think that piece is missing. I find that a lot of managers manage everybody on their team the same way. And it's a relationship, which means the dynamic should be specific to the person whom you're managing. And that's a really tough thing to also expect of someone if they've never learned that before. So I do think that that's a gap for sure, and something that maybe, people need to consider more in HR or just in a company in general, whatever the case may be. So that, and I really also love just the way we spoke about guilt, because I think that is a huge piece for people not wanting to be the scapegoat or the whistleblower, but in reality you're creating a better culture for everyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, this is kind of navigating to a completely different topic, but I'm just curious, because in that same study, they were saying that men and women almost exclusively still fall in love at work. Women, it's 52%, a little bit more, and men, it's 48%. And I know at NYU, there's definitely very specific guidelines in terms of what dating at work requires, or if you're dating someone within the same department. Even obviously, because I work at a university, relationships between, professors and students, like how it's prohibited, all these things you have to do. But I feel like there's still always a sort of gray area with that. And I wonder, is there a general rule of thumb about dating in the workplace? And what practices should people at least use as a standard if there's not?
Well, I'm laughing because I met my husband in the workplace.
Yes, I'm here for it.
And we kept it very quiet.
Hmm.
Um,
That was my rule of thumb.
yeah, yeah, very quiet. But I will say the difference for us is that so that we were not in the same. There was no reporting relationship,
Okay,
right? So it was a little bit more complicated because was in HR, and so I was privy to lots of
I
stuff
love
that I
that.
then
Wow, what a great
had,
position to be in.
yeah. So I had to be. I mean, I'll tell you honestly, there's still things that I've never told my husband
Mm,
because I take the confidentiality requirement very seriously
right.
as an HR person. So, yeah, we'll talk about things, and there's still things I'm like, you don't really know the whole story behind that. But I
Yeah.
just, it was
It's
my
like your
role not
version of
to.
HIPAA. You can't share. You
Yeah,
can't share.
yeah. And often there's no reason, like there's no point in sharing,
Right.
right? There's just some things there's no point. So, but if it's a reporting relationship, that's really tricky, and the problem, the even trickier thing is still, if we talk about, there's a reporting relationship, somebody's higher in the hierarchy because of the demographics of most workforces, it likely is still going to be the man is in the higher position,
Right.
right? The male, if it's a male female
Hmm.
relationship, right?
Hmm.
But, just because of the way, luckily it's not always true. But so then if we talk about, well, what happens with that relationship, that power dynamic, that's what most companies are trying to avoid, is
Mm,
that it's just messy, right?
right.
It's just messy to have that reporting relationship. So I think the problem is more and more though, where else do people meet?
I was gonna say,
Online
where do you meet
and at
people?
work?
I mean,
Yeah.
I was in grad school, and the person I was dating, we worked at the bookstore together. But that was
Mhm.
really also a social setting for us. That's
Right.
where everybody, you're around the same age, you're in school, you're going through the same experiences. And even now where I work, everyone is around the same age, and everyone is
Yeah.
working, and you're spending, sometimes for a lot of people, they spend more time at work than they do at home, or than they do
Right.
during social settings. So if it's not on a dating app, that's one of the only other places where you might meet
Right.
someone.
Yeah. So I think knowing if there's a particular policy, and usually at least in my experience, the policies are about the reporting relationship. And sometimes what it is that you just have to go if it's, serious, and let HR somebody know,
Yeah.
hey, we have this relationship. Now, that's on paper. Does everybody always do that? I can't imagine they
Yeah,
do.
I think more people keep it quiet, and that's how
Yeah.
I've always been. I
Right.
think just keep your private life your private life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. And I mean, I was just, I don't know if you followed the McDonald's CEO who recently over the summer had to step down, and a lot
In
of it was
quotes.
he was having relationships with,
Wow.
I think, like 4 employees,
Yikes.
that he,
No, not
so
McDonald's. Come on now,
right,
y'all.
I know. But so when you have that happening at the top of the house,
Right.
it's a little hard then to kind of expect the rest of the culture, that do as I say, not as I do
Yeah,
thing
yeah.
is a little tricky. But I think it's become so much more complicated because
I think
people
so.
do spend so much time there.
And people do, I think, tend to overreact. I definitely had a friend who quietly was dating someone and the manager found out and they assumed automatically that it needed to be reported to HR and that it would be an issue for whatever reason, this or that. And it was almost like you made it your business, though. It was never an issue until you turned it into an issue. So I do think there is. I do think you make a great point of also knowing your workplace culture and who you can share things with and just being mindful. I think also for people to keep it professional. I think personally speaking,
Mhm.
like if someone knows I'm dating someone at work, I'm not going to be having a conversation with you about it between 9 to 5. And if you go through a breakup, unfortunately you still have to keep it professional because you're in a workplace, so I think those are the pros and cons people have to weigh. But I think you're very right in terms of like looking at practices and policies before you, and I think it's just so you're aware of it so you can also determine what makes sense for the relationship that you're in, because you might just be getting to know someone, like you don't have to
Right.
do it right from the jump.
Right. And the reason why it's particularly, I think it's usually more of a sticking point when there is that reporting relationship is
Hmm.
because we can all say now, oh, if we broke up, we would still be collegial to each
Right,
other and we'll be professional. But that's our logical selves right now. And
right.
so I think there's enough examples where something goes terribly wrong.
Yeah,
And then what the company's worried about is that, I was dating my boss and we had this terrible breakup.
yeah.
And now I come to HR and I say, I've just been denied a promotion I know I should get because he's being spiteful because we had a relationship and we broke up.
Right,
So now, and then that's when it starts to create like bigger problems. So
right.
that's what HR, when there's the ability, when there's a decision maker who can make decisions that are going to impact somebody else, and
Hmm.
that could be influenced because of the relationship, for better or for worse, right? Like
So should people not date their boss?
people should not date their boss.
We have it on record.
People
Do not date your boss. Do not
do
date
not.
someone who's managing you.
I mean, really, you shouldn't, and I know it happens. I think at some point, then you should not have that reporting
Or get a
relationship.
new
Like,
job.
yeah, get a new job. I mean, I think really it does. At some point, you have to decide if I really want this relationship, unless it's a company that says hey, we're okay with that, because there
Yeah,
are companies who are like, hey, that's the reality of life. But
right.
if it's a company that has any of those policies, I think like tread carefully
Yeah.
is just what I would say.
And bosses, don't date your employees, because I definitely know also of bosses who are very flirtatious with their employees, or like they
Yeah.
have that sort of dynamic, especially men and younger women who are in
Yeah.
workplaces. Like it's very flirtatious and it's like why? And it puts, I think, women sometimes in a weird position because you don't want to be dismissive because you don't know if that's going to offend the person. There's always those weird nuances. So I definitely
Right.
think trying to neutralize that as much is
Right.
helpful, is smart.
Yeah, and if you're dating your boss and you're doing really well and you get a promotion and you're successful and everybody around you knows you're dating the boss, I mean, it also then trickles out to, well,
Right.
did Dash get the promotion
Yeah.
because she really deserved it, or is she getting any, a little
Yeah.
bit of special treatment? So it just creates this kind of
Weird tension,
yeah.
which is frustrating because you should only, I think, regardless of the relationship you have with anybody, anything you receive, like any sort of promotion, should be based solely on your work and what you do. But I mean, that's not always the reality of a situation. But I agree that like people just need to be mindful of those nuances. So
Right.
yeah,
And other people's perception. So the reality may be absolutely you deserve that promotion, and whether
yeah,
you were dating your boss or not, you would have gotten the promotion. But the perception of the people around you is then what could potentially create an issue
Right.
if their perception is anything different. So
Right.
it's part of it is just the perception versus even the reality of what
Of a
could
situation.
be a problem.
Okay. Okay, so last topic, and I'm actually curious about your take on this topic, is diversity, equity, inclusion, which is huge. Obviously, companies are jumping on board to support diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace. Many people are creating or hiring new positions to help create DIE strategies. And I think a lot of people are realizing there are many benefits to doing that and having, it's greater innovation, you have a happier and more productive teams, it's more inclusive, there's increased customer retention, satisfaction, higher profits, all these sorts of things that trickle down to the bottom line. But a majority of those positions, they're ending up under human resources. That's where a lot of that, those new positions are going. And I'm curious, do you think that's the right approach? Is diversity, equity, inclusion something that should be under an HR function?
I think it depends on the HR function. I think it really because I I don't think it should with I don't think it should be a default place for diversity, equity, and inclusion because I think there can be a natural contradiction sometimes with some of the work that HR does and some of the work that we would hope that a DEI officer or vice president would be doing. But I think it can. I think it depends on the company, and it depends a lot on the reputation of the HR function.
Okay.
If the HR function is known to be kind of the gatekeepers, I mean, sometimes HR is viewed as being more of the blocker than the enabler,
Hmm.
right? I mean, I think that's just some of the reputation that HR can have.
Right.
And I think if that's the reputation, then that is absolutely not where you want to put the DEI work.
Okay. Well, it's interesting too because HR is a department in and of itself. And sometimes I wonder if DEI is like an issue even within HR departments. Like how much diversity is in an HR department. So really placing that responsibility on them, it sometimes feels like it's a little lazy.
Yeah. Well, I think also, I mean, I've recently had this conversation with an organization who is creating DEI, and their HR department is not proactive.
Mm,
And there have been issues that the HR department clearly has not taken up and has not dealt with in the way that many people felt they should have dealt with it.
mm.
So to put DEI in that department,
It'd be ineffective.
it'd be completely, I mean, just at the outset, again, going back to perception, just the perception of putting it in that department, you've already tied two hands and a foot behind the
Right.
DEI person's
Right.
back, because now they have to get over that perception of they're part of the problem.
Right.
They're coming in. And you're right, because HR, if the HR department who should be looking at who's getting hired, who's being retained, who's getting promotion, right? Like most HR departments, I hope, are doing that work. So if they're not doing that well, then they definitely are part of the broken system
Hmm.
that's going to need to be addressed. And if you put the DEI in the broken system, it's not gonna
Right.
help
And then it
anything.
just feels also that it's a little bit performative, I think,
Yeah.
is what it ends up feeling like. I do wonder sometimes if it's smarter to have DEI as a standalone department on its own and HR almost is informed by them, because
Hmm.
then you can hire people who are experts in that field, or at least have a more comprehensive understanding on how to navigate those sorts of nuances, because the reality, diversity, equity, inclusion, it's so intersectional in so many different
Hmm.
ways. And I also feel like if you work in HR, you may not have necessarily been taught how to navigate those spaces depending on how long you've been in the
Hmm.
industry. I'm sure people who are now entering the HR field are learning maybe more expansive things about those subjects just because of the climate of the world and workspaces. But if you've been in the game a long time, that may not have been something that was a priority. So now for that to be a priority, that's also a huge learning curve. That's a huge expectation to have of an entire department, I feel like.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I agree 1,000%. I think that the ability, I think, to be effective DEI, it takes a pretty broad skill set and a competency that, yes, I think more and more HR training and, the SHRM, Society of Human Resource Management, of course, is, recognizes the importance of diversity and inclusion. But I do think that your point is well taken, that for many, many HR professionals, it probably wasn't something that they were trained in. And so, just like we were saying, how do you hold managers accountable if nobody's been helping to train them and inform them and mentor them? Same thing with an HR department. I mean, it's their job, but I think they may need experts to help them to do it
Yeah.
well. So,
Yeah.
I mean, ideally, I think most people would agree if you have a DEI, vice president or director, or as close to the top of the organization as you can, the better.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Taking into account everything, and especially, where we are in the current political and social climate, what do you see as the future for HR, the role that they play in workspaces?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, it's reading the crystal ball, right? I
Mhm.
think one of the reasons I like HR, like teaching HR, is it's not going away. Like
Right.
all the different jobs and the industries that we are looking at, thinking, oh my gosh, it's not going to be here in however many years, 3 years, 5 years, because there's always going to be humans, like somewhere in the organization, even if they're the ones programming the robots, there
Right.
will be humans. And so you need to have people who help manage the humans.
Hmm.
So the good news is I think it's a critical function that's here to stay. There's a lot of things that are making it more and more complicated, like the fact that we are having so many people now who are shifting to work, being workers in the gig economy,
Mm.
and the fact that so many people are not full-time employees. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a
A
whole
lot of people
nother
are working for
complication.
themselves. They're their own
Yeah,
HR.
right. Or you have a lot of the cases, like looking at Uber and Lyft,
Mm.
and are they employees or
Right.
are they not employees? Are they contractors or are they not? So I think that the nature of the employment relationship is shifting. You have that, but then you also have, if you look at Amazon, the past week where Amazon was facing the potential for being unionized for the first time, I think that there's like this tension between, on one side, the independent contractor who works for him or herself, and then you have groups of employees who are like, oh my gosh, we totally see the value in having a union, to have that voice as a
Right.
group, to have some semblance of power, which you get when you have groups of employees who are being represented and who are, aligned. And so, and then you have the force of undeniably diversity, equity, inclusion, even if you're just doing it because you have to. It's like you do it because you have to,
Hmm.
right? You do it because it's important to your business to be successful. You do it because it's the right thing to do to create the right work environment for everybody, right? It can be any one of those three,
Right.
or all three, or some of the three. I think there's no denying that HR has to be a player in ensuring that that is also part of the equation. So I think the future for HR is becoming even more complicated in how they have to navigate these different forces. And of course, being financially viable is just, the pressure for that gets more and more and more,
Right.
right?
Right.
As it's more of a global workplace, and we have to think about how do we be profitable. And so I think the future for HR is just, we're going to have to get better people, more skilled people who know the business, know how to run a business. I mean, if you think about it, you have to know how to run a business. You have to know all the interpersonal skills. You really need to know all of the skills around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how to
Right.
navigate some of that,
Need
those
fresh blood.
opportunities.
Fresh blood is the future.
Yeah, I think that, and lots of ongoing training is really
Yeah.
important. I don't think you can take somebody like it used to be and just put them in HR and they get to work out the rest of their career, whatever that is. I
Yeah.
think there's just so much change and need for adaptation that I think it'll be exciting for people who like change and like professional development and all of that. But if you're somebody who just like wants to learn your little domain and that's
Yeah.
it, I think it would be hard.
Yeah. This is my very, very last question.
Okay.
So, just based on that, even the future, what do you think is the relationship an employee should seek to have with HR?
I'm going to think for a minute
Totally
before I just.
fair.
Um, I'm pausing because I'm thinking about if I put on my HR hat, to be perfectly honest, depending upon the size of the company, like I said, I've worked in big companies.
Yeah.
The fear I would have is like, I don't want to, and I'm being completely honest, as an HR person, I would hate to open the door and be like, every single employee, please come in and talk to me
Right.
about the experience,
Right.
right? Like that would be overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
I think, though, if we don't create a mechanism for more communication and feedback about what's really happening in the organization, then that creates blind spots that can be, at the least create a less effective workforce, and at the extreme leave your company open for some really potentially problematic behaviors and culture.
Right.
I mean, I think that part of it is HR needs to facilitate ways to get information, whether it's employee surveys that people feel are honestly worth completing
Mm-hmm.
because the information gets taken seriously,
Right.
whether it's 360-degree feedback. I mean, when I worked at IBM, they did 360-degree feedback. So I still remember my employee who just like blasted me in that feedback. And it was hard to hear, but I was like, okay,
Yeah.
I obviously missed a huge piece of what this employee needed. Back to
Mm-hmm.
your point of not treating everybody the same.
Yeah.
So if a company, if HR has no mechanisms other than assuming their managers are doing all that work
Yeah.
and are taking care of that, then I think that they are um, putting themselves in a bad position. So
Right.
I think it's, and so what can an individual do? I think an individual should feel that they are able to go to HR for advice and counsel if they are not getting that from their manager.
Yeah. I think that's fair. I think that should be at any level. And if that's not happening, then I think it's a door for a larger conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, ideally, the system is supposed to work. HR helps helps managers get skilled. Managers then manage effectively and productively and fairly their employees, right? And then so they become that kind of conduit. But if that's not happening,
I think
then
it's
what are your
changing
choices?
though. And I think you're right. And it is a gray area. But I think, thank you for your time. Because I
My
do think
pleasure.
a lot of gray spaces and gray areas we really tackled that I think don't seem like gray areas for people, but they really are. And so it's definitely helpful to have insight from someone who's on honestly on the outside, or the inside facing out, because I think sometimes that perspective is missing, and that perspective is important because you're right, it's not an easy job. And I think like anybody who's, evolving with the way the world is changing, that's being required of HR employees. And that's a tricky thing to do when there's so many new things that you have to consider now in workplaces. So thank you for sharing your knowledge and what you know. It was really, I'm excited for this conversation to hit the airwaves.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you for giving me the chance um, to share my opinions about it. I love HR. I think HR is a fantastic field to be in, and and I joked about, oh, we're people. People used to say I like people, but the truth is, you really should like people, because if every time an employee shows up at your door, you think, oh
Here
no,
we
what
go.
are they doing here? That's not really, that would be an unfortunate person to have in HR. So I think having people who are open and want to hear how things are going, that's what you need as an HR professional.
I love that. And we're going to wrap it up right there.
All right.
All right, y'all. That was really such an awesome say what. I loved talking to Kim, y'all. She was just so informative And you know what I'm really enjoying so far about these episodes is these conversations I'm having with people. The reality is the topics that I'm curious about are evergreen topics, y'all. Like the reality is HR is always going to exist in some capacity, like Kim said. There's always going to be some needed interaction with human beings, some sort of relationship. So it's really interesting. It's just my brain always jumps like light years ahead, and I'm just curious, like, how are these topics I'm talking about now going to exist in a space a year from now, or 2 years from now, or a decade from now? You know, like these topics. And what I'm getting at is basically that I'm excited to revisit these topics. Like, I hope that this isn't the only conversation I have about HR. You know, I hope that I can have it from a different person's perspective. I remember I hosted a kind of like a session at work where we were discussing another podcast that we were listening to. And one of not my direct colleagues, but someone who works at NYU who identifies as trans, brought up the fact that that podcast really didn't speak to their experience in the workplace. And I just thought that was such, a curious thing. There are so many voices that are not as amplified when we're talking about HR. And so this was really very much an introductory conversation to what, is a larger topic and is really intersectional in many different ways. We can talk about HR, just through the lens, of the typical topics we hear, whether it's harassment or racism or, microaggressions in the workplace. But microaggressions don't only apply to race. They apply to people who deal with disabilities, people who have, medical needs that are not always met, accessibility. I think there's just so many different avenues that people don't consider when we're talking about workspaces. So I really do think it's very much an introductory conversation, and I'm excited to revisit it in the future, hopefully with Kim or maybe with, another guest. But I hope you all enjoyed the conversation. And now it is time to close out the show with the Red Room. It's getting like more dramatic every single time, y'all. It really is. So this week on the Rec Room, y'all, I really just wanted to kind of throw it back. I wanted to throw it back to some old school favorites of mine. I think definitely in the next coming episodes, I'll have like more updated, recent, more present shows and content to share with y'all. I definitely have so much stored in the back of my mind that I almost have to think of like, oh my gosh, what's the most precedent one that I like want to share it with folks that like I've really always enjoyed, that's like how I think about it. And sometimes it's a mixture of, something I just recently experienced. And that's kind of the case for my recommendations this week. So I don't know about y'all, but, given everything going on in the world, when I'm in a space where I feel like my community or, when I just feel low, sometimes the way for me to feel better is to kind of dive deep into content that reminds me about the beautiful things about my culture. And I'm talking about Black culture. I'm talking about the intersectionalities of Black culture. And there are so many different shows, and there's so many different songs. There's so many different movies that really just remind me of the magic and the beauty and the golden, nature of what it is to be Black. Everything we touch, it's like Midas, like it's enjoyable. And if it's not enjoyable, there's another message that almost comes from it. There's just something of depth that I think really exists. So needless to say, this week, my first recommendation, and I'm so excited to share it, is 17 Again. And no, I'm not talking about 17 Again with Zac Efron, which was actually so upsetting, y'all, that was the first thing that comes up. But it's 17 Again completely spelled out. And if y'all don't know this movie, it stars Tia and Tamara Mowry and their younger brother Taj Mowry. So, like, the whole Mowry empire, which arguably, like, I think, we didn't realize they were kind of like, in some ways, like, I feel like the Mowrys walked so the Smiths could run, just in terms of like Black families that really were kind of owning the game and kind of doing it together. And maybe I'm wrong there, but like that's kind of the vibe that I get from their family. But 17 again is an American fantasy comedy film, and surprisingly, it was always on Disney Channel, but it is not a Disney Channel movie. It first aired on Showtime in 2000, so this movie is 21 years old. So first of all, I didn't know this, but it was executive produced by Boyz II Men, Sean Stockman, and he also served as the film's music composer, and that's actually a big part of why I love it. Basically the premise of the story is these grandparents who have been bickering since they separated long time ago. Something happened that really broke them apart. They end up accidentally, through a scientific sort of experiment mishap, becoming 17 years old again. And so they have a chance to kind of revisit aspects of their life that they probably wish they had done differently when they were younger, whether that's like the way they lived their life or their actual relationship with each other. So it's a very cute little love story. And I will say the grandparents are hella petty for people their age. And the reason why they broke up is also kind of like, wait, what? Like, y'all could have worked that out. But it's just such a fun movie. It's such a feel-good movie. Like, you can't help but watch this movie and laugh or just remark on how cute Taj Mori is when he was so young. Like, it's a feel-good movie. And also it has I forgot about this scene, y'all, and this used to be one of my favorite scenes back in the day, because the grandparents are from a different era. They were like from the 20s. They really like big band swing music, which I'm a big fan of that as well, personally, myself. Like, I would love to learn how to swing dance. I feel like that would be so fun to, like, be flipped around or, like, fly through someone's legs, or cutest looks, cutest outfits, and Black people turned it out. But there is a scene where they basically do a whole choreography, like a whole dance number, and it was fire. Like, clearly, the lead actors learned how to do this dance for real, and it was just really, really entertaining and really, really enjoyable. So I didn't know this as well, but they won for best work in progress at the American Black Film Festival in 2000, and they also were nominated for the Young Artist Award for a lot of different categories. But just a really, really great film, really fun film. Like, I don't know, it's just a feel-good film, and it's one of those things that I feel like is maybe underrated. It's on Vudu, actually, and it's free with advertisements, which, y'all, for the first time I was like, wait, I actually want to pay for this movie, because this movie is so valuable, and it is for the culture. So if you've never seen 17 again, it's all spelled out with Tia and Samara Mowry and Taj Mowry. You can Google it. But it's just a really good film. It's really fun, and yeah, check it out. My next film was inspired by Earth Day. So I think we should all be a fan of the Earth, but we have to live here. But I've really just in the last few years, I took a trip to Costa Rica when I turned 27, and it just gave me a newfound respect, honestly, for our natural resources and for wildlife and just the preservation of the world that we live in. I'm not a perfect person by any means. There are days when I'm lazy about recycling. There are days when I don't need to have my heater on all day when I'm leaving the house. Like, not by any means. There are ways that I'm constantly trying to improve myself, but I do think it's important to just continuing to be mindful of the planet we exist in and what we're leaving for the generations that come after us. So needless to say, I'm saying all this serious shit, y'all, but the movie I'm about to suggest is literally an animated musical fantasy film. It's called Fern Gully, The Last Rainforest, and it actually came out in 1992 when I was 1 year old, but it is such a good movie. And it's basically, Fern Gully is set in an Australian rainforest, and it's inhabited by fairies, including this lead fairy. Her name is Krista, and she basically accidentally shrinks a human. His name is Zach, and they go through this like whole adventure through the rainforest, but it really has this underlying message of environmentalism, and really, because the character who is the villain is kind of this abstract thing called Hexus, but it's essentially this machine that's cutting down the rainforest, and there's this excess that comes out of it, like, noxious gas, noxious oils. So it's very much a metaphor for basically, the importance of environmentalism and the importance of, maintaining, just making sure that we're taking care of the planet. So it's a really fun movie. And fun fact, this movie, Ferngully, was Robin Williams' first animation role. And the character he plays, which is this adorable bat named Batty Coda, was created specifically for him. So that, Robin Williams is one of my favorite actors, and it's still really difficult actually to this day for me to watch films that he's in because it truly, truly broke my heart. I would say Robin Williams and Alan Rickman, like those deaths really tore me apart in terms of just like actors. So but it's still a really fun film, and it's a really wonderful way to remember him. He provided 14 hours worth of improvised lines for the part, which had been regularly conceived like as an 8-minute role. So he was just really impressed with Robin Williams' voice work that he gave him like this really standout role. And it's crazy because he went on to provide his voice for the genie afterwards in the same year, and they fought so hard for him not to be in two, and he refused, and he killed it in both. And I think, he actually got so much bigger, because of playing the genie in Aladdin. But this is really a fun role if you really are a fan of Robin Williams. So that was the second movie. And just so y'all know, like, they talk about Ferngully a little bit more in Disney Pixar, like in books and different documentaries, but I do think it's really underrated, and it's just really fun. They have great music. It's a great soundtrack. I would say it's kind of like a mix of like 80s and 90s, just really beautiful imagery for their time. And like, it's super whimsical with these fairies, and like literally Krista, she has these like bomb ass dance moves. They're like having a party full of fairies and she's just twerking it back. Like, it's a fun little fantasy animated film. So like, live your life, take an hour and a half and enjoy Ferngully. And then my very last recommendation, y'all, is Firefly. I have to like give props where props are due. I learned about this show from the last relationship that I was in like years ago. And I'm sure people try to forget all the different things they want about their ex and neutralize all that shit, and I am definitely down with that. But sometimes like exes provide you with like gems, and this was one of those for me. This was something that I appreciated learning from this person. But this show is called Firefly, and it's an American space western drama television series. I had never heard of this show before this person told me about it. So this show, it's set in the year 2517, and it's basically after the arrival of humans in a new star system. It follows the adventures of this renegade crew called Serenity, or Serenity is the name of their ship, I should say, their spaceship. And the ensemble cast basically portrays 9 characters who live on Serenity. And it's just kind of about these 9 people looking into, the blankness of space and seeing 9 different perspectives, So it explores the lives of these people. It explores some of them who fought, in this sort of civil war that happened. And it's basically about living on the fringes of society as part of like pioneer culture in the star system. So there are like actual elements to the show, like they have their own language, they have different conflicts that are kind of tied to this central federal government called the Alliance. Like, there's so many different things, but what makes it really cool is that it's this sci-fi western aesthetic. And so it really blends all these elements from space opera to western genres. It depicts humanity's future in a manner that's really different from contemporary science fiction. So it's just a really cool show. But here's the catch. It really has a huge cult status because it was canceled, y'all. It was voted number 11 on Entertainment Weekly's 25 best cult TV shows from the past 25 years in 2012. But like I said, it was canceled. So it was canceled, and I'm not really sure why it was canceled, but y'all, people were pissed off about it. And so much so that they ended up creating a movie that completed the story for people. So Firefly is a show, and then Serenity is the name of the film, which basically ties the whole story up together with a bow, which they couldn't do obviously in the longer form of a television show. And when I say it was canceled, y'all, what I mean is like there's only one season of this show. Like, they canceled it after one season, but it became so popular and the demand was so high from such a niche group that they literally made a movie to tie it up in a bow. And they actually did that with another show called Sense8. Honorable mention, Sense8 on Netflix, which is also kind of like even next level, far much more next level. But they did the same thing. They had a couple of seasons, they got canceled, and people were so shook by that they made a film to satisfy viewers who were really fans of the show. So that's the same thing with Firefly and Serenity. It's really enjoyable. I didn't think I expected to like it as much as I did when I first started watching it, but you really kind of get wrapped up in the storylines, you get wrapped up in the characters, and you really kind of have a newfound respect also for just the way they have, I don't know, the way they explore the future, the way that it's like 9 roommates living on a ship, so it's like funny shit goes down, there are arguments, there's tension, there's romance. It kind of has everything you're looking for in a show, but it's original. It's very much its own. It's autonomous. Like, I don't think I've ever seen any sort of show that's like Firefly. So I really appreciate it. It's a good time. I think it's a really fun throwback to watch when you're stuck at home in the middle of quarantine, or if you're trying to find something a little more lighthearted to watch, a little more humorous, a little more fun, but also still has action in it. It's a good time. It's a good time. So those are my 3 recommendations this week, y'all. Thank you so much for sticking around. It's been, like I said before, it's been quite a week. And so just remember to be gentle with yourself, to be kind to yourself, to truly always remember that you're made of stardust and that the world is a much, much better place because you're in it. Till next time, y'all, take care of yourself, be good to yourself, make good choices, be good people, all right? Catch you on the airwaves next time, sweet peas.